My earliest remembrance of the village of Northeast Harbor is what a wonderful, vibrant, fun place it was to return to every summer. And I particularly remember the friendliness of the people who, if you're from away, as I am and always will be, it takes a while before you're taken in by the year-rounders. But when they accept you and take you in for what you are, you have a friend for life. And I'll always remember that for all my years.
I loved it right away. I just thought this was a wonderful village. And by the end of the summer, when I had to go back to Texas to go back to college, I really felt that Northeast Harbor was my home.
It's my spiritual home, if you want to sum it up. There's beauty, there's peace, there's security, there's love.
I don't think Northeast Harbor can continue as a viable community if houses are continuing to be sold off to summer people. It cannot just end up as a summer bedroom place. It needs new forms of economic activity, and I don't see much movement in that direction.
Every time a house changes hands, it goes from year-round to seasonal, and I don't see how that trend doesn't continue. So I think the sad part is that maybe in 10 years you may not see a grocery store here in the winter anymore because there won't be enough people to support it. You may not see a hardware store. I mean, this is not the easiest place in the world to make a living in. My father had a saying once. He said, if you stay around Northeast Harbor, you'll probably never amount to anything. He says, but on the other hand, you couldn't pick a prettier spot to be a failure in.
I went near an island about 4 or 5 leagues long. The distance from this island to the mainland on the north is not 100 paces. It is very high, with notches here and there, so that it appears, when one is at sea, like 7 or 8 mountains rising together. The tops of most of them are without trees because they are nothing but rock. The only trees are pines, firs, and birches. I called it Ile des Monts Déserts. Those words were written by Samuel D. Champlain on September 5, 1604. The name meant Island of the Deserted Mountains. Champlain's vessel ran aground somewhere along its rugged coast, an inconvenience that gave him the opportunity to make a detailed map of the area. Champlain was not the first European explorer to sight the island, but the name he chose for it stuck, lasting long enough to be anglicized by the settlers who would later move into the region. The Island of the Deserted Mountains would ultimately become Mount Desert Island, Maine. Today, Mount Desert Island is a busy tourist destination, home to over 10,000 year-round residents and the only national park in New England. The island is divided up into 4 towns and their attendant villages. In the north is Bar Harbor, the most populous town and a commercial center for the entire island, while on the western side are the towns of Tremont and Southwest Harbor. The 4th municipality is the town of Mount Desert, made up of 6 villages stretched diagonally across the face of the island. In the northwest is the village of Pretty Marsh, including the privately owned Bartlett's Island. Then nearby are the villages of Soamesville and Hall Quarry. On the southeastern edge of the island are the villages of Seal Harbor and Otter Creek. And located between these points is the village of Northeast Harbor, the administrative center of the town. In its early days, the village went by the name of Sand Point, although by the middle of the 19th century, the name Northeast Harbor had eclipsed it. The precise origin of the name is not known. Some sources say that it originated from the fact that the village was northeast of the settlement at Southwest Harbor, while the descendants of some of the original settlers would suggest that the name came from the protection the harbor provided from northeasterly winds. The first of those original Northeast Harbor settlers was the Manchester family, whose patriarch John arrived in 1775, building a home on what is now Manchester Point. John Manchester came to the island from Machias, where, according to family lore, he had previously taken part in the seizure of the HMS Margarita, a small British warship that was captured by revolutionaries under one Jeremiah O'Brien. On Mount Desert Island, the war caught up with Manchester. While he was out hunting one autumn day, British forces seeking supplies and possibly retaliating for the Margarita landed and raided the family's homestead. They allowed the house to remain standing, but they did destroy the family's cooking implements. They also stole provisions and slaughtered all but one of the family's livestock. Not all was lost for the Manchesters. A moose was sighted swimming across nearby Somme Sound, and John Manchester took off after it in his canoe. The meat from the moose, along with help provided by other Mount Desert settlers, allowed the Manchesters to survive the difficult winter ahead.
To be young and to grow up in Northeast Harbor in the 50s and 60s, I thought it was a lot of fun, and I say that for several reasons. There were a lot of kids my own age in the village at that time, so that there was always something to do. The winter was quiet, but we were mostly, of course, at that time concerned with school. But the weekends were a lot of fun, but you had to sort of make your own entertainment in many ways. The summer was 180 degrees different from the winter. The summer we all looked forward to because there was going to be a big burst of activity. All of a sudden people came from all over the country, all over the world here in the summer, and shops opened up and movie theaters opened up. So it was a whole different world. So I think as a young person, you always looked forward to the activity of the summer. I think it was more of a nuisance for our parents because that's how they made their living, so they had to work very hard. But for we kids, we couldn't wait for it. It was just great. Politics seemed to be very important to people of my generation. When I was in high school, my friends and I, we talked about politics probably as much as we talked about sports or girls, for example. My first interest in politics came during the election of 1960 when John Kennedy was running for president. It was something I was fascinated by, and I was a great admirer of Kennedy. And I think he was sort of given that idea that it was important that you give something back, that you serve. And so when I was in my late 20s, I thought that perhaps I had something to contribute to the town, and so I ran for local office for the Board of Selectmen, and I was maybe 25 years old at the time, and I lost. I lost that first election by 9 votes. At that time, the Board of Selectmen would have been people that are my age now and older. It wasn't really the place for a 24 or a 25-year-old person to be. That just wasn't considered to be the way things were done then. But by only losing by 9 votes, people thought I'd actually won. So the next time I ran, I won, and won fairly easily, and I stayed. But it was something a way to contribute, and it was interesting. I thought it was very interesting, and I wanted to try to give something back to the community, which I thought had been very good to me over the years.
In the summer of 1880, a group of Harvard students calling themselves the Champlain Society embarked upon a scientific expedition to Mount Desert Island. The group included 2 brothers, Charles and Samuel Eliot. Their father was Charles William Eliot, president of Harvard College since 1869. President Eliot busied himself reforming the college and turning it into a modern institution of learning. But the Harvard academic schedule gave him summers off. The two sons persuaded their father to visit Mount Desert Island, and the elder Eliot quickly decided to build a summer cottage in Northeast Harbor. At almost the same moment, two other future summer residents were on the island. A Massachusetts landscape architect named Joseph Henry Curtis visited that year, as did William Croswell Doane, the Episcopal Bishop of Albany. Both men would ultimately build summer cottages in Northeast Harbor as well.
Interesting point is that Northeast Harbor itself was probably one of the last communities to develop on Mount Desert Island. By the 1850s, you had steam vessel service into Southwest. During the late 1840s and 1850s, you had the early rusticators coming into the area. Northeast has to its advantage a reasonably well-sheltered harbor, but nobody needed the area that is now the village for anything. Doane played a very significant role in the development of the community, both by bringing his family and by bringing his friends, a lot of whom settled along the shore of the harbor. Eliot also brought family, and his descendants and friends settled here, summering. And what they came to Northeast for, when they came, they were not artists. Artists went to Solmesville and then Bar Harbor. They were not bankers or financiers. They went to Bar Harbor. These guys were clergymen and professors. And what they were looking for was truly rustication, a simple way of life. And at a time in which Bar Harbor was beginning to develop large and fancy summer homes of the type that are being built here now in Northeast, these guys wanted simplicity. They were very anxious to see the people who are here the year round have opportunities. And I think now of people like Asa Knowles, who started out as a child lugging firewood for Bishop Doane and others, and who was encouraged to go to college and wound up the chancellor of Northeastern in Boston, building up the university to a very high level. It was a very interesting and very supportive, very pleasant kind of community. And it was a single community that simply grew in the summer.
My name is Peter Godfrey. I live in suburban Philadelphia, and I've been coming to my beloved Northeast Harbor, Maine, for 80 summers. Not to give away my age, that meant I started pretty young as a baby. My grandparents had a house which still stands, called the Bishop's Gate Within, which is right across from where the Kimball House Hotel used to be. I believe my grandparents first came here around 1880 when they acquired the Bishop's Gate Within. And then my parents would come and stay with them, and the first year I was born, I was there. And of course, one of the great ways of getting here was by train, or the Bar Harbor Express. But that was a wonderful occasion, which ran from Washington to Ellsworth, overnight train. And many of the summer people came that way. So that was the way my family used to come up here, and as a child, I looked forward to that with enormous pleasure. In the old days, most of the summer people did everything they could to become friends with the local people and see if there was anything they could do to be of help and what have you. The purpose of the Summer Residence Association, which fortunately enough I was involved in its founding when it was the Summer Year-Round Planning Committee. And in those days there were 5 of us in the Summer Year-Round Planning Committee. And we would fly up in the wintertime, the 5 of us, And we would meet over the firehouse, the top of the firehouse, in the bitter cold of January or February, whatever it was, with the leadership of the town. And we would sit over a period of 2 days and just talk about the problems and opportunities facing the town. And what can the summer people do to help solve some of the problems? So it was a genuine sit-down, give and take, a sharing of ideas with the commonality of working together to try to help the town with its problems. And I was not exaggerating when at the meeting last summer of the Summer Residents Association, I got up and I said, you know, in my opinion, I think Northeast Harbor is dying. The cleaning shop is just closed. There's no drugstore. Always, you walk down Main Street now and you see art galleries and dress shops. And God forbid if the magazine store were ever to close down, or if the hardware store were ever to close down, or the home store, 3 of the remaining ones from times gone by. I said, if that happened, the place would be gone. It's terrible. Very sad.
Mount Desert, Maine is the rising star of Maine's attractions for the summer home seekers. Apart from any little sideshows which may have been put up in the papers from time to time by shrewd and calculating capitalists, Mount Desert has gifts that are all its own, and such as will continue to swell its fame as years progress and its charms become revealed. Its area is reckoned at about 100 square miles, and it is therefore quite a little world in itself. The island might aptly be likened to a lot of marbles dropped from the pocket of a giant, provided a giant's marbles were small mountains. At least the more notable and striking portions of the island are made up of a group of mountains huddled together, and of a singularly wild grandeur. The indications within a few years are unmistakable that Mount Desert will take a rank among the families of the wealthy and fashionable second to none on the coast, or even the continent. As soon as the needed capital determines to invest and the newspapers open their trumpet throats to proclaim Mount Desert and all about it, the armies of summer pilgrims will commence the mighty march to the grand and glorious Mount Desert. Batchelder's Popular Resorts and How to Reach Them, 1874.
In the decades before the Civil War, a bridge was built connecting the island to the mainland. Steamboat service connected it to other points along the east coast, and the first rusticators came to Mount Desert after artists like Thomas Cole and Frederick Edwin Church painted the island's beauty for their urban audiences. As more visitors came to Mount Desert in the years after the war, the island's villages changed rapidly.
In 1870, there were 16 farmsteads in Northeast. And as a core community, it gained its centrality both from the fact that it was centrally located among the villages of the town of Mount Desert, within the town of Mount Desert, and because the population exploded in the 1880s, 1890s. If you had come to Northeast Harbor in the late 1870s, you would have seen very little that you would recognize today. But if you were to come here in 1890, you could find your way around.
To walk the streets of Northeast, it was not unusual to meet a college president, because of course President Eliot was here, the president of Harvard, President Angell of Yale, and President Lowe of Columbia. And of course the bishops congregated. The great Bishop Rhea of New York City would be here. And the whole atmosphere of the place was one of deeply religious and intellectual interest.
We have had a good many bishops of the state of Maine. It is still the custom amongst both, I think, the resident people and the summer people to speak of the bishop. And when they speak of the bishop, they mean Bishop Down. If you are going to speak of a bishop of Maine, Over all these years, when anyone was referring to the Bishop of Maine, they referred to him as Bishop so-and-so. But when you spoke of the bishop, you meant Bishop Doane. But as a little girl, I thought that Bishop Doane was God. And it was a long time before I realized that he wasn't. He was the personification of God to me as a little girl. And of course this stems from the things that I heard about him, and this shows the reverence with which he was held by everybody with whom I communicated as a child.
Before the rusticators, Northeast Harbor was so rural that it lacked even a church, and Bishop Doane found himself conducting Sunday services in the home of Squire Daniel Kimball, a village resident, and then later on in his newly built summer cottage named Magnum Donum. Soon those spaces weren't big enough for the number of parishioners. The result was the rustic slab chapel of St. Mary's by the Sea, constructed primarily with funds donated by summer resident Edward N. Perkins and his late wife, and with labor and material donated by village residents. St. Mary's by the Sea held its first services in the summer of 1882.
It is simply, plainly, roughly built, out of the same stuff of which we build houses and barns. But from this day forth it is not a common house. It is separated and set apart, to be treated and used with reverence, because it is the Lord's house, in which it pleaseth him to dwell. Yea, the Lord will abide in it forever. William Croswell Doane.
In 1896, a winter chapel was built for the congregation, and in 1901, the summer slab chapel was raised, replaced by a more permanent stone structure the following year. In its initial form, St. Mary's by the Sea was functionally interdenominational, although as early as 1883, Charles W. Eliot, a Unitarian, and others outside the Episcopal faith began holding worship services in a one-room schoolhouse in the village. By 1889, this congregation was large enough to build its own house of worship at the foot of Schoolhouse Ledge. Charles Eliot himself served on the building committee alongside two of John Manchester's descendants. Officially known as the Union Church, there were some in the community who jokingly referred to it as St. Charles in the Woods. The growing population soon brought even more religious diversity to the village. A third house of worship followed in 1895, becoming the Catholic Church of St. Ignatius.
The summer community was attracted first by the simplicity of the way of life available to them here, and then by the natural features. They could pack picnics and climb mountains. They could pack picnics and travel by boat to the various offshore islands. And in doing that, let's take boats. We'll use boats as the stepping mechanism. In doing that, they commenced to go from rowing boats to sailing boats, and from sailing boats to more sophisticated sailing boats. And then they got their sailing boats together, and they formed a fleet of them, and then they took to racing them. And you can see the process taking place by which you have what amounts to a yacht club. Other entertainments came along. They developed a golf course on Jonas Corson's farm. Tricky thing, though, it was leased land. Mr. Corson reserved the right to graze his cows there, as a result of which the golf ball often went splat when it hit. The swimming club, the tennis club. Swimming club was an interesting case in point. These all came about as summer entertainments. The swimming club is unique because that was the watershed. In the building of the churches and in the library and other institutions, the townspeople could obtain sweat equity by giving lumber, by giving labor. There was no exclusion until the swimming club. And that, by subscription and by intention, omitted the year-rounders. You could sit next to them in church, but you couldn't splash with them in the water. That was the tipping point at which the summer residents established themselves as socially distinct from the year-round population.
My name is Fred Rogers, and I was born in Northeast Harbor and grew up in Northeast Harbor. And my father came from Jonesport, and my mother was a native of Northeast Harbor, one of the 16 original families. Went to high school at the Mount Desert Elementary School, and was in fact the last graduating high school class from that school. The next year they started at the island school. I moved to Norway in 1979, and I've been there for the last 28 years. But when I look back on Northeast, I guess I think of the relationship between the local people and the summer people. I live in Norway now, and even if it's not Norway, it could very well be someplace in the Midwest of the United States. It's very difficult to explain to them the way of life here. And I know we refer to them as summer people, but it's very difficult to explain that concept to other people, especially in other countries, this concept of summer people and local people, and that you've got this massive increase in population for 2 or 3 months of the year, and everybody turns out and works for these people and does work, and then all of a sudden it's over at the beginning of September. And you try to explain that to people, and it's quite an alien way of life in most places. There were individuals here, there were ambassadors, there were secretaries in the government, there were cabinet officers, there were all kinds of people here. So you didn't, at that time we were so young, we didn't always know who we were actually dealing with. But they were all here. You could go down to Main Street and you could see any number of notable people in the course of the day. I can remember military helicopters landing in what's now the ball field behind the elementary school, which was the high school at the time. And although I didn't see them, I was later told that that was General Westmoreland was here to visit somebody. So you had this kind of activity going on. It wasn't, helicopters flying around playing. It wasn't unusual to see these kind of things. You didn't always know what was going on, but you knew that it was somebody of some importance. I can remember up in one of the homes on Schoolhouse Ledge actually had a red phone and in the summertime it was hooked up directly to the White House. And when you saw these things, because you'd heard about them and you'd read about them, and here it was, and it was red, it really was. And you were told this, and you were quite amazed because you thought, not everybody gets to see this. This is actually how it happens. I certainly learned from it. I probably hadn't gone to college if I hadn't worked for Gary Moore on his sailboat all those summers.
This portion of the Gary Moore Show has been brought to you by Stay Puft Rinse, the revolutionary new laundry rinse, and Stay Flow, America's #1 liquid laundry starch.
Crazy thing, I went to bed last night about 9:30 and slept like a log. Had trouble getting up this morning, and somehow or other it doesn't help me any. I feel weaker than Marilyn Monroe's shoulder strap.
Back in the late 50s and the early 60s, he had 2 shows. He had I've Got a Secret, and he had a variety show called The Gary Moore Show, which was some singing and dancing and comedy skits and so forth and so on. And the I've Got a Secret was a straightforward game show.
Now, sir, if you'll whisper your secret to me, I'm sure the folks at home would like to know what it is.
His real name was Thomas Garrison Moffett. He was a very down-to-earth person. There was no pretenses about him whatsoever. I can tell a little story kind of to illustrate that. When we sailed his boat up, used to keep his boat in Portland, and we'd sail it up in the spring. And so we'd take 2 or 3 days doing it, so we'd overnight on the boat, and one of us or somebody would always have to try and cook something, and none of us were particularly good at cooking, him included. I can remember I made corned beef hash, but unfortunately I burnt it on one side quite badly. So while we were eating, he noticed that I was kind of scraping mine off the burnt side. And he said, "Fred, don't you like that?" And I said, "Yes, but it's a little bit burnt." And he said, "Oh, that's the best part." And he reached over with his fork and took it off my plate and ate it himself. And I think that's kind of illustrative of the kind of person he was. He was pretty down to earth, and he was very helpful, very interested, very personable. I think in the conversations I had with him, I mean, he'd met so many people, and he could talk about people he'd met, and he could tell you experiences and what he'd seen and what he'd done. And I think that kind of helped me make up my mind that I wanted to go to college, that I just didn't want to work at some manual task or something all my life. I wanted to actually try and see if I could do something. I think he started coming here in the mid-60s, early 60s, and I think he came back every summer until he died. Unfortunately, he died of emphysema. He was a heavy smoker, which is kind of ironic because his major sponsor for I've Got a Secret was Winston cigarettes, and he used to get them free his entire life. Even after the program was over, they used to come to him by the carton, and unfortunately, he smoked them by the carton. He never was able to give it up, unfortunately.
The reason that my parents came up here was largely their friendship with the Dones. Northeast Harbour, as everyone knows, was founded as a summer community by Bishop Doane of Albany on the west side of the harbour and President Eliot of Harvard on the right. My family were relations of the Eliots and saw a good deal of them. I first came here at the age of 4 or 3. In 1890 or 1891, in the steamer City of Richmond. One went on board the City of Richmond at Portland after a train journey from Boston or New York, spent the night on board, and woke up in the morning amid the delicious smells and sights of Edgemoregan Reach. The Richmond didn't last very long. She was succeeded by the Mount Desert of the Boston and Bangor Steamship Company, and she, after doing excellent service for over 20 years, was succeeded by the J.T. Morse, who many people still remember, although it's now 30 or 40 years since she made her last voyage to the island, and her hoarse whistle was heard in the western wag.
The Industrial Revolution generated ease of transport, which had a major and immediate effect here. The Civil War, of course, slowed the process of moving down east, but it did not slow the process of industrialization. Not a bit. From the close of the Civil War until about 1933, major transportation was available seasonally by water. You could leave Boston on a Friday afternoon, arrive in Northeast Harbor on a Saturday morning, spend the weekend with your family in a summer home on Schoolhouse Ledge, and on Sunday afternoon get back on the boat, change boats in Rockland, go back to Boston, and Monday morning arrive fresh as a daisy in your law office on Beacon Street or whatever.
By the early 20th century, the seasonal population was a permanent fixture of the village, with their yearly arrivals and departures giving a rhythm to each summer. An organization of summer residents called the Village Improvement Society cut hiking trails through the surrounding woods, collected trash, and wetted the dirt streets to keep the dust under control. Others labored for the creation of a community center called the Neighborhood House, a space that would come to hold a library, a bowling alley, and a pool hall. It would also field its own sports teams for the village's young people. The Neighborhood House was at one time used for activities like town meetings, although other groups took advantage of the building, including the Ku Klux Klan. In 1925, the Klan held a Christmas Eve rally at the Union Church, followed by a Christmas night event outside of the Neighborhood House. In spite of the money they spent and the projects they undertook, the summer residents were not the only source of income for the year-round population. The subsistence farming and fishing that had characterized village life for much of the 19th century had by then given way to new industries in the community.
About 1890, an enterprising group that exported ice from Maine farms to New York, New Orleans, and even to India decided that a slide through the woods from Lower Headlock Pond to Northeast Harbor would be just the thing. They built it, and the ice would be shoved along this wooden trestle through the woods in great cakes. And I can just remember seeing men pushing these cakes of ice along the trestle. After it ceased to be used for that purpose, the children loved to walk along that trestle, which in many places must have been as much as 15 feet above the ground.
I've been as a summer person on this island since my birth in 1931 anyway. In those days, and since 1877, the family had lived in Bar Harbor, but with the enormous house that was unmanageable and the taxes and all the rest of it, they moved. People at that time were very skeptical that a place like Northeast Harbor would survive. They were saying, after all, and this is the air age, people can go to Europe so much more easily. What's the future for a summer resort? In those days, I did a lot of climbing, which wasn't as popular then as it is now. And I think the thing that meant the most was the mountains. I had climbed every one by the end of each summer. I married, went off in the Foreign Service, and my first assignment overseas was Yemen, then Athens, all during the Cyprus crisis, the first Cyprus crisis. It was a very interesting time. Then to Beirut, which was about the best assignment I ever had. Then back to Washington to the Economic Bureau. Then Chile after the Pinochet takeover. And then ultimately wound up in Tehran. I was waiting for another assignment, but I went out there on temporary duty and to take over the economic section so the regular head of it could go home and see his family. And during that time, in November of '79, the embassy was taken over. And so I had what was really a pretty determinative, instrumental change in my life. Having studied about the Middle East and served there, but as a diplomat, we were a little bit like a summer person in Maine. I mean, you're there, but you're not part of it, of that community. Do you see what I mean? This reminds me when I went in the Army after college, and this was in the Transportation Corps, in Harborcraft, which I'd asked to do because I considered myself a sailor. And I reached for a chart. I was helping the instructor. And I pulled out 1202, I think, which was the area that included Mount Desert. And he said, "How do you know that chart?" And I said, "Well, I live there." And he said, "Where? In Northeast Harbor?" He said, "So do I." He was one of the Cousins family. And I said, he said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "Out near the golf course." "Oh, you mean out by the Kennedy place?" So it kind of shows just from that how I was not integrated into, as summer people were not, particularly in those days, into the community, the wider community.
In 1789, Mount Desert Island and the Cranberry Isles, some of the islands in Blue Hill Bay as well, were named in the town of Mount Desert, which was a comprehensive township established in the year in which the Massachusetts General Court established a number of towns in Maine. The town of Mount Desert, comprising all of Mount Desert Island and most of the offshore islands, was unwieldy. As a result, other settlements divided off. That left a single civil entity sweeping from Bartlett's Island in the northwest corner to Otter Creek in the southeast, which remains to this day an unwieldy town. And I remember from my years as a summer cop that it is a half-hour drive from Bartlett's Island Landing to Otter Creek to deal with an emergency there. That's a pretty serious piece of road work. There's a lot of geography in the town and not a lot of cohesion aside from the fact that it's a town.
By the early 20th century, the demographics of the town of Mount Desert had dramatically changed. The village of Soamesville, home to the first permanent European settlement on the island, had traditionally been the center of town government and commerce. But the growth of Northeast Harbor in the last 2 decades of the 19th century meant that Soamesville was being eclipsed in both population and industry. In early 1916, a town meeting was held there to decide the question of whether or not the local government should be moved to Northeast Harbor. A ballot on the issue was taken. It was a tie. Another ballot was taken. That was also a tie. What happened next is detailed in an unsigned document found in the archives of the Northeast Harbor Library, believed to have been written by village attorney Jerome Knowles.
All the afternoon the battle raged, and ballot after ballot was taken, still fruitless. The sun was going down behind the hills, and it was probably for the last time that a ballot would be taken for the day. The wearied voters lined up once more, still prepared to hang to it like bulldogs to the seat of a tramp's trousers, when at the end of the hall came a ringing cheer, and borne very carefully and tenderly on a stretcher by a crowd of the younger generation came an old man who had been sick for months, and who had not left his bed during the winter. All the way from Northeast Harbor he had been brought to settle the question for good and all. Cheers on cheers went up as the old man feebly deposited his vote in the ballot box, the vote which was to decide the fate of a community, while the silence of defeat was on the lips and faces of the upholders of the old order of things, which had truly changed, giving place to new.
The village of Northeast Harbor was the new seat of government for the town of Mount Desert. Other changes were coming to the area. In 1901, Charles Eliot convened a meeting of summer residents from all across the island. Eliot was worried. The invention of the portable sawmill threatened the island with deforestation. Something had to be done to protect it. The result was the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations, a corporation dedicated to acquiring and preserving the island's remaining undeveloped land. In 1916, those efforts resulted in the creation of the Sieur du Mont National Monument, followed by the creation of Lafayette National Park in 1919. Renamed Acadia 10 years later, it was the first national park east of the Mississippi River. Also considered a threat to the island was the growing popularity of the automobile. Many of Northeast Harbor's rusticators also joined in the battle to keep cars out of the town of Mount Desert. Despite being made legal elsewhere on the island, motor vehicles were outlawed on the town's roads. Leading summer residents such as President Eliot supported the ban, even as some town residents and business people attempted to have it overturned.
That was a hard-fought battle. And what you had was the rusticators on the one hand, led by people like John D. Rockefeller Jr., who wished to keep the clatter and hubbub and smell of the horseless carriage off the street. I don't know that you've ever smelled the odor of one of those very early vehicles. Black powder smoke has nothing on what those things emitted. They were foul.
The fight over automobiles ended at the state legislature in Augusta, who ultimately settled the matter in 1915.
The island and the legislature were for several years the scenes of combat between the automobile and the horse, a combat naturally won by the beast with the steel skeleton and the gasoline lungs. But it was a brave fight. Many of us thought, and some of us still think, that one large island left in all this vast continent where one could come and live the simple life of ante-motor days, free from their noise and smell and risk, might not be an excessive proportion. And so we propounded this view to successive town meetings where we were successful, and to successive legislatures where we were not successful. The fight had its amusing moments. President Eliot, who always came with us to Augusta for the hearings, had written a book extolling the many beauties of the island. "Sir," said the opposing counsel, "would you hinder the millions of your fellow countrymen traveling by motor from entering the island and enjoying those beauties?" William Warren Vaughan.
William Croswell Doane served as the first bishop of the Episcopal Diocese in Albany for over 40 years. He spent more than 3 decades of that time summering in Northeast Harbor. More than almost any man, he appreciated the beauty of Mount Desert Island. Death spared him from having to hear and smell the automobile on the roads of his beloved village. He died in New York City in May of 1913, aged 81. Charles W. Eliot retired from Harvard in 1909 after an unprecedented 40-year tenure. He continued to summer in Northeast Harbor, where he died in August of 1926, age 92. Joseph Henry Curtis, the third of the 1880 rusticators, also continued to summer in Northeast Harbor. Upon his death in 1928, he left his house and remaining holdings of village land to the town. Today, they are the site of the popular Thuya Garden, designed and planted by village landscape architect Charles Savage in the 1950s. Herbert Kenny, owner of the Harborside Inn and Pastime Theater in Northeast Harbor in the late 20s and early 30s, used his home movie camera to document life in the village in those days. His 16mm images show ice fishing on Somme Sound, ice cutting at Upper Hadlock Pond, and even the staff of the Harborside Inn mugging for the camera. By the time Kenny shot this footage of the J.T. Morse coming into port, steamboat service to the island was in permanent decline. The J.T. Morse stopped running in 1931. The community could not completely escape the effects of the Great Depression, although its impact was less severe on Mount Desert Island when compared to many other parts of the country.
I came to live in Northeast Harbor because I came here to go to high school, because we didn't have any schools in our area. So I came over here and lived with a manual training teacher. His name was Mr. Crooker, and that's how I happened to come here in the beginning. It was very busy for World War II. There was so much activity. We had 3 grocery stores, 2 restaurants, and everybody was working.
When the rich people came here prior to the war, they never drove their own cars. They had to have chauffeurs. Well, in effect, that brought that much more influx of people. And you wouldn't realize to see the town now what it was on a summer night when the movies got out and you walk down the street and you couldn't find a place to sit in any of the restaurants or beer parlors or anything else. The town was just flooded with that extra people.
Even before Pearl Harbor, some young members of Northeast Harbor's summer community left the United States to join the Canadian Armed Forces and fight against Germany. After Pearl Harbor, Mount Desert Island quickly found itself caught up in the intrigues of the war. German submarines prowled the Gulf of Maine, and in November of 1944, one U-boat even surfaced in nearby Frenchman's Bay, dropping off 2 enemy spies at Hancock Point on the mainland. At local companies, such as the Mount Desert Yacht Yard, small vessels were built under contract to the Navy, while in Northeast Harbor, a local woman named Wilma Clark edited a newsletter, the Mount Desert Messenger, that went out to both the year-round and summer residents serving in the armed forces. Those who remained made the best out of their circumstances.
During the war years, it was kind of fun. You know, you had to have blackout shades everywhere, and the hotel had a lot of windows. Everybody would get kind of bored sitting in the lobby every night. You couldn't go anywhere because you couldn't have lights on your car and things. So anyway, Lauren would get an old lantern, and we'd have flashlights, and he'd get a whole group collected that wanted to go to the movies, and we'd walk up to the Pastime Theater with our lanterns and our flashlights and everything.
In the autumn of 1947, a fire broke out near Dolliver's Dump on the outskirts of Bar Harbor. Defying every effort by firefighters to extinguish it, the blaze grew over the coming days, turning into an enormous forest fire after gale force winds fanned the flames. The town of Bar Harbor was encircled and almost cut off by the fire, which then raced south, blackening thousands of acres of Acadia National Park and menacing the eastern half of the town of Mount Desert. For 10 days, the fire threatened the entire island with destruction before being contained and slowly extinguished. The town of Mount Desert escaped serious damage, but the town of Bar Harbor was not so lucky, with much of the community lying in ruins. Bar Harbor had been home to a summer colony of its very own. The stretch of land known as Millionaire's Row had been the site of palatial mansions that had dwarfed the summer cottages in Northeast Harbor. But many of the Bar Harbor homes had been left vacant by the Depression and the war. Now, a huge number of them were gone completely, putting a final end to that way of life in the community. Bar Harbor would rebuild itself as a tourist destination, and a small number of Bar Harbor summer residents would make Northeast Harbor their new seasonal home. In Northeast Harbor, the shape of things was literally changing. In the first half of the 1950s, a shallow expanse of water known as Fraser's Cove disappeared in the wake of a development project. The Army Corps of Engineers dredged the harbor. A granite bulkhead was built across the mouth of the cove, and the refuse from the dredging was used to fill it in, creating space for new marina facilities. The harbor shrank, but its mooring capacity was almost doubled by the project. The extra moorings were well utilized. Sailing was more popular than ever amongst the summer residents, including participation in competitive sailboat races held by the Northeast Harbor Fleet, a sailing club formed in 1923. But for the summer residents, the time available to participate in these activities was shrinking. For the time that summer visitors did come, they traveled increasingly to the island by automobile. On December 13, 1955, Maine Governor Edmund S. Muskie attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony to mark the opening of the final stretch of the Maine Turnpike. For tourists and summer residents who preferred to travel in their own cars, the new highway dramatically shortened the amount of time it took to drive to Mount Desert Island from outside the state. The completion of the turnpike hastened the decline of railroads on the coast of Maine. The famous Bar Harbor Express began to close down in 1957 when the Maine Central Railroad Company eliminated the line's stop in nearby Ellsworth. For the next 3 years, the train would come no closer than Bangor and would cease service entirely in 1960. Bus service would also soon start to disappear, leaving the automobile as the prime method for coming to the island.
In this community, in this broader community, Northeast Harbor and environs, in the town of Mount Desert, we grew up in much the same way as in Leave It to Beaver. One income family was all that was required, a stay-at-home mom, and a number of people would take on a second job in the summertime. People worked roughly 40 hours a week, plus or minus, and with the second job, maybe the mother might cook for restaurants or take in laundry or whatever was involved.
This was a cottage community, and what I mean by that is we made their money by people that came in July and stayed until Labor Day. And they had residences here, they had seasonal residences. And many of my friends' families, their parents worked either directly for these summer people on their boats or around their cottages, or they worked as a result of the commerce that they engendered. For example, they would work in some of the stores, or they were plumbers or carpenters or other trades that were there to service those cottages.
Well, that would have been the age when there were a lot of parties and dances and what have you, so it was a very joyous, pleasure-giving time, and with very few worries. It was a golden era in many, many ways.
There were wonderful people around, and there was a bridge. I got to be friends with Samuel Eliot Morison, who at that time had two Pulitzers. He was a curmudgeonly sort, and once you got to know him moderately well, he was much less curmudgeonly and respectful. And then when you got to be really good friends with him, he was a curmudgeon again. There were a number of others. I sat at the circ desk one Saturday, and there were 4 old men in flannel shirts sitting around the fireplace. 3 of them harassing the 4th. And that 4th was Admiral Morison, who was not curmudgeonly, he was meek and saying, "Oh yes, yes, you're right." And they were saying things like, "Sam, you're no more an admiral than I'm a taxi driver." And he was saying, "Yes, yes, you're right, but Mr. Roosevelt wanted a history of the naval operations in World War II written, and I had to have some way to get on planes." The guys who were chewing on him, in faded flannel shirts all, one of them commanded the destroyer screen at Normandy. One of them was the naval architect who played a major role in designing the artificial harbors that were set up at Normandy. And the other one, Admiral Alan Kirk, was in overall command of the seaborne Normandy invasion. And underneath those faded flannel shirts were so many stars you can't believe it. And the junior guy who was taking the ragging, Rear Admiral Morison, had 2, and all of the rest of them had at least 3. And they were all seasonal residents here, and by the way, terrible drivers. They must have been much more used to issuing commands than turning the wheel themselves. In the summer of 1968, I took a job with the police department, but as a result of open heart surgery, couldn't do that job. So 68 was a fallow year, and the summer of 69 I started in working for the police. I have to say that during the daytime, as a summer officer, the most important, vital weapon I carried was a stack of tourist maps. The main thing we did was to chalk tires and to give directions to lost tourists. Most of the things that went on in those days were either slightly dangerous, slightly amusing, or outright hilarious. We had to deal with complaints such as the naked lady doing primal scream therapy on the site of the old Kimball house. And we thought we had a nutcase on our hands, and actually all we had was a perfectly reasonable and rational naked lady doing primal scream therapy on the site of the Kimball house. There were serious issues in the community at that time. They were, some of them alcohol related, some of them having to do with personal relationships and not limited to the year-round population. My first domestic abuse arrest was not a year-round resident.
The attitudes people had in those days, a degree of snobbery and racism almost that was really extraordinary when you look at it. I remember there were the Kimball House dances that we all went to, and someone staying there who was up on business who looked Jewish, and there was some complaint that he might want to dance. I mean, this kind of thing is just incredible. But it was sort of accepted. There was a Chinese diplomat from Taiwan, a military attaché, came up to stay at the Kimball House and was barred from the swimming club because he was Chinese. And I remember somebody saying to my mother, well, you wouldn't want a Chinese looking at your daughters in their bathing suits. I mean, and then the hilarious thing was when my nephew, my mother's grandson, married Chinese. She's a lovely lady who has a house up here now from Taiwan, and had their first child, the grandchild. My mother marched her great-grandchild down to the swimming club and introduced the baby to the person who had thrown out the Chinese military attaché. So a few people stood up for what was right, but I wouldn't blame Northeast Harbor for these attitudes as much as these were prevailing attitudes among the kind of people who came here for the summer. And it was sort of, as I look back on it, a kind of measurement of how far we've come as a country, not just Northeast Harbor, since then.
The village was still pretty much the same from the time I was in elementary school to the time when I was about a junior in college. I think the biggest factor around the changing was a couple of fires that took down some of the village structures that the kids enjoyed. For example, the movie theater that was there in the summer. As a result of that movie theater being there, businesses on the main street stayed open at night. So until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, there would always be a group of teenagers and adults and everything milling around the streets of the village after 6 o'clock. You don't see that today because there's really nothing that keeps any of those businesses open. But that was a big difference, and that lasted up through my junior year of college. And then a fire took out that theater. It affected the character of the village more in the summer than it did the winter, because that theater wasn't open in the winter, nor were any of those businesses open at night in the winter. But it certainly changed the character of the village in the summer dramatically, and in my opinion, for the worse, because all of a sudden what became a gathering spot was empty. At 6 o'clock at night, you could fire a cannon down the main street.
Well, I'm Winnie Smart, and I'm the one that started this art theme here in Northeast Harbor. When I came, there were only very fancy, very expensive dress shops and no art gallery. So I just felt that they needed an art gallery and they needed me to paint for them. So I've been working here for 40 years, 40 summers, and my daughter Gail has taken over.
In the summer, I lived here in my whole youth. We lived in a houseboat out on the harbor. We had no running water, no electricity. Everything was run by the propane tanks like you run your gas grill on. It was fascinating and fun. I wouldn't have traded it for anything. I do have a problem with Monopoly still, though. I think I burned out on that as a kid.
When we first came to Maine, when we bought the houseboat, we had it in Bar Harbor, and it was a terribly rough harbor. The tourists were always pointing their cameras on us. We came over here, and it seemed like heaven. We brought the boat over here, and it was just so wonderful. And I loved the town. At first, I was very fearful of coming here because I felt it was a very elite community, and I wasn't sure if we would be accepted. But they did. They just took us to heart and loved the children and introduced us to other people. My children were very close friends with many of their children. I love nature, and I feel that my painting is almost a religious experience. I just want people to feel it and smell it and remember it. So I paint in a realistic but slightly impressionistic way.
Well, actually, I tell people I was groomed from conception because my mother wanted a daughter to go painting with forever and ever. So this is something we've done together, and we've traveled all around. I am a plein air painter. I try to get out and paint as much as possible and out of doors and to capture the essence of the scene. My paintings are like a diary, and they're, instead of words, I'm not the best with words, I'm the best with my paintbrush. And if you look around at my work, you'll see, and it's all out there. Our clientele is a broad mixture. We've been here 41 years, as I mentioned before, and people have collected my mother's art, Winnie Smart's art, for all that time. And there isn't a cottage around that doesn't have at least one of her pieces, at least. And a lot of the families, the older families that collected her, now their children collect me, the next generation, which I thought was I never expected that one. Smart Studio is open mid-May to mid-October. But yes, we are seasonal here, and it really dies after Columbus Day.
A fire followed by an explosion leveled 2 buildings and damaged 3 more in Northeast Harbor this morning. Fire crews were called to a restaurant on Main Street around 3 o'clock before an explosion rocked another building. A firefighter on the scene was injured. He is now in the hospital. No word on his condition. Fire officials do believe the explosion was caused by propane tanks.
I'm living on Great Cranberry Island now, and somebody was knocking on my door at 5 in the morning, which is very unusual. And the man is saying that all of Main Street is on fire in Northeast Harbor. So after a few minutes to calm down, I called Gail, and I was prepared for the worst. I had no thought that our building could survive. The buildings are all old wood, and I just couldn't possibly dream that our building would still stand. And of course, the street was all blocked off, and all the firemen were holding these huge hoses, just these great big hoses, and pouring water on all the buildings. And we were able to walk way around and come across the street, and the sun came out and shone on our building. It was a miracle. We were there, it was still standing.
Today, Mount Desert Island is a bustling tourist destination. Particularly popular is the town of Bar Harbor, a commercial center littered with shops, restaurants, and hotels, and a frequent destination for cruise ship visits. Elsewhere on the island, visitors photograph the picturesque lighthouse at Bass Harbor Head, kayak near Seal Cove, and shop and eat in Southwest Harbor. Acadia National Park remains the biggest attraction on the island. Each year, the park receives over 2 million visitors, and every summer, tourists from all over the world swim in the waters off Sand Beach, climb mountains with names like Cadillac, Dorr, and Champlain, and bike on carriage roads built by John D. Rockefeller Jr. After September, an abundance of leaf watchers has extended the tourist season into the autumn months. Although many locals use it for recreation, the presence of the national park is not, and never has been, universally popular among island residents.
This gives me a thought about heritage, because a person like myself, being born and brought up here from the earliest time when people settled here, feel that their heritage is being undercut by things like the Nature Conservancy or the Heritage Trust, which is doing nothing to prolong our way of living other than putting this land aside, and the towns are losing tax money. Old Odioba said, he told Woodbury that he wouldn't see it. Woodbury might see it, but perhaps not. That at one time there would be a gate across the road up at Thompson's Island, and the whole thing would be parkland. If he's right, which looks more and more every day, our heritage is gone. That's the thing that bothers me.
As for the town of Mount Desert, settlements that were once busy centers of activity are today quiet. The village of Hall Quarry, once home to a bustling granite extraction site, is today primarily a residential area, as are the villages of Pretty Marsh and Otter Creek. The villages of Somesville and Seal Harbor each have small commercial districts, but Northeast Harbor is the only settlement with an actual downtown area, and even here, most of Main Street is closed in the winter. The year-round population of Northeast Harbor peaked in the 1970s, when there were over 1,000 permanent residents in the village, and declined in the decades that followed. United States government census records show that in the year 2000, there were 527 persons living as permanent residents in the village's zip code. That number dropped to 488 at the time of the 2010 census, which also recorded that only 254 of the village's 654 housing units were occupied on a permanent basis. The town of Mount Desert as a whole has grown slightly in population, but the increases have been in the villages that make up the town's western half, where real estate is less expensive and more land is available for development. But the summer months are busier than ever here. Seasonal residents enjoy the swimming and tennis clubs, participate in Northeast Harbor fleet races, and play rounds at the newly renovated Northeast Harbor Golf Club. Many former Northeast Harbor residents have moved elsewhere in search of more affordable housing, and many of the remaining year-round residents work outside the village or even off the island. Despite recent improvements to this intersection, traffic on the Trenton Bridge remains a problem during the summer months, especially in the early mornings and late afternoons. The bridge is only wide enough to accommodate one lane of traffic in each direction. Many islanders both work and do their shopping in the nearby city of Ellsworth, a commercial center on the mainland where big box stores and fast food chains proliferate. Some island residents have to travel even farther than Ellsworth for their livelihood.
A typical work day in my life now, I get up about 5 in the morning, and I work in Bangor. And Bangor is the largest city in this part of the state, and it's almost 50 miles from here. I find that a good deal of my time is spent in a car, about an hour and 15 to an hour and 20 minutes each way. So that's close to 3 hours a day that I spend in a car. I work and I do career counseling in Bangor, and I do that until late afternoon, and so I get back home again between 5 and 6. So I'm gone 11 or 12 hours just about every day, except for the weekend. So that means my attachment to the village is much less so than it would have been perhaps for my parents.
Welcome to Mount Desert's 200th birthday party. I'm sorry that Steve Parody didn't provide us with a northwest breeze and clear blue skies. What one of the former members of our summer colony referred to as a typical Northeast Harbor kind of day. This is probably more like it anyway. I'm not involved in town politics now because I did 17 years on the Board of Selectmen, including 8 years as a chairman, and I think at that particular time, after that amount of years, you get tired. And I think you get to the point where you just don't feel that you can give back to the position what it deserves. And at that particular time, as I got through, is when I took the job. So by the time I would come back at night, it would be quite late getting back from work, and then once or twice a week you'd have to go for 2 or 3 hours of meetings. So it was just a matter, I think, of a combination of 17 years of actually doing it and perhaps being tired of it, and also the fact that I was working out of the village and it was sort of losing touch, and it was a time element.
McGrath has been in our family for about 50 years. It's older than I am. It was first came into our family by my great aunt, whose name was Adelma McGrath. That's where the name comes from. Then my grandmother had it, which was her sister. Then my mother, and then I've had it since 1993. The store fluctuates a great deal on the seasons. Obviously here, being a tourist area that relies on summer, that is the big time of year. July and August are by far the biggest time. I would say that those 2 months combined is probably close to half of our yearly income. The winter, starting after Christmas, really slows down. And I think that's why we've moved toward really gearing for the summer type of market. From now, probably January through April, it's very slow. Most of it's going to be DVD rentals and that type of thing. We used to be more of a year-round business. Back when my grandmother owned the place, we actually did a lot of toys and so forth. Once we first started into videos, which is about 1983, that became kind of our bread and butter for the business. Then of course it changed to DVDs, and now that is kind of starting to wane a little bit. So I think now we're heading more toward the summer clientele, the gift items, the books, newspapers, magazines. We still deal with a lot as far as money, but there's not a lot of markup there. I believe McGrath's in another 5 or 10 years will probably move to more of a seasonal business. I think that's the way it's going. I believe, especially my mom, who is 83 years old, when she retires from this, I really believe that we'll probably be closed during the slowest months of the year. I don't believe we'll be open from January through April.
Nantucketization is a term I first heard from Dennis Damon. Nantucket and the other islands off Massachusetts and Block Island set the pace for the transformation of a real living community to a seasonal thing. And I do remember some of this. Dennis sitting there on the bench in front of the firehouse saying, you know, in 15 years, this will all be art galleries and boutiques. And I remember Don Hagberg, when he closed his drugstore, saying in 10 years, there won't be any drugstore, there won't be any this, that, or the other thing, referring to community service organizations. There's going to be nothing here but art galleries and boutiques. That's Nantucketization.
Back 8 years ago, I put the house on the market, and I did so just because I needed to leave for some family reasons, and I felt that I was going to be gone for several years, and that it might be best for me to sell the house. And it was interesting because I used to joke, people would always say to me, well, if you sell your house, it'll become a summer house. And I used to joke and say, no, when I sell my house, it'll become an art gallery.
Today, Northeast Harbor's Main Street is home to 3 art galleries, as well as numerous boutiques and specialty stores selling antiques and related items.
I don't feel that having more than one art gallery is a detriment. I think one year we had something like 13 businesses that were selling art here. And it really does help it become an art destination. Just like Rockport, Massachusetts is a place where everyone goes to buy art, and they have galleries just up and down the road.
Unfortunately, the reason that we have those galleries is that is what makes money. But even in this type of a town, we are affected, like most areas, with the big box stores and the big grocery stores. It would be nice to have the town the way it was when I grew up, but it's not going to happen. The support is not there. We cannot have such things as a drugstore in this town. Like I said, I'm going to have to move seasonally. There's no support year-round.
Let us pledge to listen at all times. Let us lower our voices and open our minds, and recognize that lasting solutions can be forged because there is more that unites us than what divides us. We are aware of the explosion of real estate prices on this island and the scarcity of housing readily available, but let us neither throw up our hands in despair nor panic and turn in desperation to selfish and simplistic solutions to our problems. We cannot turn back the hands of time, nor repeal the laws of supply and demand through votes of town meetings.
In a step-by-step progression, the summer homes became larger. They ringed the shore, and we used to talk about the donut. The idea was that the summer residents were entitled to the donut and the year-rounders got the whole. I was around as a teenager, and my stepfather was town manager when what they called double booking came to an end. And what was said at that time was the year-round population has had it. It's only a matter of time before folks of moderate income are not going to be able to live here. And that was a very true prediction. In 1963, the state said, hey, all people are not treated equal here. An individual who owns a year-round home and has a moderate income, but has a water view, shorefront property, is not taxed at the same level as the individual who comes here for the summer. This cat let out of the bag meant that not that the summer residents' taxes went down, but the year-rounders' taxes went up. The desirability of shorefront was lost when it was recognized that if the shorefront was in year-round hands, it was of less value than it was in summer hands. Yes, it was an injustice, but the outcome of justice isn't always pleasant. So we'll go to from 1963 to 1973, and at that time, the people who lived here the year round, having seen the value of their property increase dramatically, also found that the house down the street was becoming seasonal. The first one was when one of the druggists, George McVetti, sold his house on Rock End Road to Harry Nelson. Harry was so much a member of the community that, and so fondly thought of, that it seemed of no particular significance. But the truth is, he was a investment banker in Philadelphia, and his house went dark in the winter. That was the first one. So that takes us from 1973 to 2003, and the recognition that a village that was very vibrant the year around and had a barber, hairdressers, gas stations, grocery stores, pharmacy, doctors, a couple of them, a dentist or two. Now, there is very, very little left after Columbus Day weekend because it isn't needed. A druggist isn't going to make a living here. A doctor isn't going to make a living here. And Northeast Harbor is not the hub of anything except at town meeting time.
When I first came into this job, I really wanted to get a finger on, the makeup of the town. And so I did an analysis breaking up the classes of property by value and looked at the spread. And I was fairly shocked to see that over 60% of the 2,600 properties had an assessed value of $1 million or more. The total assessed value for 2011 is just over $2.021 billion, which is one of the highest valued residential towns on the coast of Maine. Of that total valuation, around 42% of the total value can be attributed to the village of Northeast Harbor, which works out to about $857 million. The next highest ranking village is in Seal Harbor, which represents about 19% of the total, or around $385 million. The crash hasn't had all that much of an effect on Mount Desert. There have been a few more foreclosures by banks than I'd seen before, but there really hasn't been a noticeable effect on sale prices. The volume of properties selling has gone down, but the sale prices do continue to come at either at or above the assessed values.
The desirability to live here, at least on a seasonal basis, has gone up. And there isn't any more land along the waterfront for people to buy. So what they have to do is they will buy houses that natives had owned, and they'll convert those to seasonal residences. You go along, I can tell you off the top of my head, there are probably 15 to 20. That's probably a conservative estimate, maybe many more than that, but at least 15 to 20 homes that when I was growing up, my friends' families lived in. And they lived in them year round. Now these houses are only occupied during the summer months.
I'm lucky in that I came here early enough that I wasn't priced out of living here. At the same time, when prices become so high, everybody starts thinking of their house as an investment instead of as their home, which causes real pressure to leave. And it makes it hard for, obviously, the next generation coming up to build a house or buy a house because they just can't afford it.
It's all shifted because you can't afford to buy a house here, but you can buy one at one point in Soamesville. Now, the land in Soamesville in the last few years has gone up. We have property on Long Pond. Now that is ridiculous what that's worth. I mean, $800,000 an acre. That's not counting the building that's on it. In the town of Mount Desert here in Northeast Harbor, the enrollment has gone down. We just spent $5 million to renovate a school, which within a few years might only have less than 100 students in it. And you walk through here during the day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon now. During midweek in November, there's hardly a light on.
At a time when states, cities, and towns across the nation are slashing budgets, laying off employees, and weakening the power of public sector unions, the town of Mount Desert has stayed on a solid fiscal footing thanks to growing property tax revenues. But rising real estate prices in the town and across Mount Desert Island as a whole have had an effect on the municipal workforce, with many town employees, including the police chief and the finance director, commuting from off-island. One recent town manager even had to seek financial help from the local government before he could even afford to buy a house in the town he had been hired to run. Working together with the Summer Residents Association, the town has formed a revitalization committee. A renovation to the marina in Northeast Harbor has been built, and efforts are underway to construct new space for businesses on this Main Street lot, one of 3 made vacant by the 2008 fire. As yet, though, there have been no substantial efforts to tackle the problem of affordable housing. The decline in Northeast Harbor's year-round population has not prevented the village from consuming a disproportionate share of the town's emergency services. In 2011, nearly 50% of police incidents and fire department responses took place there.
I'm active as an officer with the ambulance service. I'm not an ambulance attendant. I've been active with the fire department as a volunteer for over 40 years. And I'm still active principally in my early 60s because there is no successor. Handling traffic control and things, there are young firefighters, not enough. And the community has been transformed into a mix of consumers of goods and services and providers of goods and services into consumers, few providers. That's not a pleasant or healthy observation, but it's fact. It was a matter of community policing. We didn't call it that. It was just police work. But everybody I dealt with knew who I was. When I walked into a domestic toward the last of it and there was a man there with a shotgun, I was able to say to him, "Hey, look, I had heart surgery several years ago and you donated blood. You want it back?" So he put the shotgun away and went peaceably up to Ellsworth. That wouldn't happen now because the cop on the beat is, or in the cruiser, and he is not a member of the community. When he goes home at night, he has to cross the Trenton Bridge to get there. My prediction is that you will see the service functions move out of the village of Northeast and into other parts of town as best as can be done. It will start with emergency services. The last thing to go, because it is the most unwieldy and most difficult to move, will be the school. Other than the fact that these things are physically here in Northeast, there is no reasonable excuse for them to be any place this side of Somme Sound.
I don't think there's been a big change in resentment by the locals toward the summer people. Having said that, my worry is that when the economy sort of collapses of the country, as one day it might, we're seeing a little bit of that right now in the real estate thing, you're going to have a lot of these mansions recently built, they're just going to be sitting empty. And if somebody's not watching after them, they're just going to fall into decay. And that's a very sad, worrisome picture. I don't know what the answer to that is. And a lot of the local families being forced off the island because they no longer can afford to live here. That's a terrible situation, which is leading to this ever-increasing drumbeat about a need for affordable housing, which I think is finally beginning to make some headway, which is wonderful. But it's late in the day.
I don't see the village of Northeast Harbor as actually declining. I see it as changing. What took place in Bar Harbor was a cycle that began with the fundamental year-round fishing farming community into which artists moved, into which financiers moved, into which the very rich moved, which generated large properties, palatial summer homes, which were abandoned, and the town then shifted to a tourist economy, and the tourist economy is spreading and fading. The year-round population is declining because a lot of the people who own the shops in Bar Harbor also go run other shops in the winter in Florida. And the cycle in Bar Harbor will turn back to ultimately to a year-round population again in some way, in some format. And the same damn thing's going to happen here. It's not a decline, it's an evolution. And there's no way to stop it. It's what's going to happen.
I think the final comment I would make is somebody said, why do you go back there for 80 years? And one reason is when you come over, you're driving up and you come over the hill up by the cemetery for the first time after you've been gone for 9 months. And you look down over the great harbor of Mount Desert. It looks just the way it did 60 or 70 years ago. And that to me is the great appeal of the place, with the world changing and falling apart in so many horrible ways all around us. To be able to return to a garden spot, which by and large looks pretty much the same as it did when you were a child, is an incredible reward. And I would hope we could keep it that way.